I don't believe anything he said.
頭先 Patrick 講嘅嘢，我全部都唔知道。
But you must trust your leaders.
不過希望大家都相信佢所講嘅嘢真實嘅。
He speaks a very good Chinese.
佢講中文好好聽喎。
And you actually understand.
你哋明佢講咩嘢啦？
That's a puzzle to me.
對我嚟講就係唔知道乜嘢嚟。
All right, lecture number 2.
而家係第2講。
What's wrong with Israel and what is the solution?
到底以色列人出咗咩問題咧？點樣解決呢個問題咧？
We're going to get into the text a little bit this hour.
呢個鐘頭裏面，我哋會睇多啲嘅經文。
We have to work our way through the first couple of chapters.
我哋先睇第1、第2章。
We are most familiar with what we call the book of deliverers.
我哋對士師記裏面關於呢啲嘅拯救者嘅故事就好熟悉啦。
Which take us from chapter 3 through chapter 16.
第3章至16章就係呢啲嘅故事。
But we're not very familiar with the first couple of chapters.
但我哋對第1、第2章就唔清楚啦。
And with the ending.
同埋嗰個書卷嘅結束。
So let's hop, skip, and jump through the first couple of chapters.
於是咧，我哋先嚟睇睇第1、第2
I
章。
wish we had more time for this.
我都希望我有更多嘅時間同大家去。
Well, what's wrong with Israel?
到底以色列人出咗咩問題咧？
I see 2 problems wrong with Israel.
我睇到有2個嘅問題。
One is the problem of infidelity to God's mission.
第一個就係對神嘅使命唔忠誠。
And the other is the problem of their infidelity to the Lord himself.
第二個就係對神自己唔忠誠。
How does this work?
嗱，咁呢個係講乜嘢咧？
Well, when we read the first chapter of Judges,
士師記嘅第1章咧，
this chapter gives us the background to the Canaanization of Israel.
就俾我哋明白以色列人被迦南人同化嗰個嘅背景。
Why is it that by the end of the book we think we're back in Canaan?
點解去到書嘅結束嘅時候，我哋覺得我哋翻去迦南人嗰種嘅光景咧？
Chapter 1 gives us a key.
第1章就係個答案。
Well, it starts out all right, doesn't it?
開始嘅時候咧，都好似好好嘅。
After the death of Joshua, the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, and they said, Who shall go up first against the Canaanites?
第1章第1節，約書亞死後，以色列人求問耶和華說：我們中間誰當首先上去攻擊迦南人，與他們爭戰？
That's a good start.
好嘅開始喎。
And the Lord answers,
神又回答：
Let the people of Judah go up first.
猶大當先上去。
And so the people of Judah go up.
於是猶大就上去啦。
And we see that they are successful.
佢哋非常成功。
And actually, the Judah's successes take us all the way through to verse 20.
由第1章嘅第1節去到第20節咧，都講猶大支派嘅成功嘅。
But then the story changes.
跟住故事就改變啦。
Now the title is The Failures of the Remaining Tribes.
我哋可以話跟住嘅經文咧，就係其他支派嘅失敗。
Judah got us off all right.
猶大就幾好啦。
But then we have Benjamin and Joseph and Manasseh and Ephraim.
但我哋睇到呢個嘅便雅憫或者係以法蓮馬尼西支派咧，
They couldn't or wouldn't take the land that God had given them.
佢哋冇辦法得到神俾佢哋嘅地。
And when they did, they let the Canaanites live among them.
就算佢哋可以攻佔一啲嘅地土，但佢哋容許迦南人喺當中居住。
But what had been the mandate?
但係神嘅命令係乜嘢咧？
Clean the place out, start over again with a new people.
就係要將呢個地方嘅人完全嘅殺滅驅逐，要重新開始。
And we land up then with the rest of the tribes.
咁跟住咧，我哋睇到其他嘅支派，
Zebulun and Asher and Naphtali and Dan.
我睇到西布倫、拿弗他利、亞設同埋但支派。
It gets worse by the time we're at the end.
去到呢個章結束嘅時候咧，係每況愈下。
In fact, the Danites couldn't take their land at all.
而但支派咧根本冇辦法奪到佢哋應得嘅土地。
By the time we get to the end of the book, we'll actually have a story about how it happened that they didn't take the land.
然後去到呢個書卷嘅結束嘅時候咧，我哋就知道點解佢哋得唔到呢個地啦。
And what their response was.
同埋最後但支派嗰個決定。
Now, it's very interesting that as you read chapter 1,
如果大家留意第一章咧，好有趣嘅。
you read a very little of the Lord's involvement.
你睇唔到好多關於神嗰個嘅介入。
God is there at the beginning.
冇錯，神喺經文嘅開首時喺度。
They ask who shall go up first.
佢哋求問神邊個應該當先上去呢？
And the Lord answers,
神
Judas
又
shall
回答
go.
佢哋，就話猶大要上去。
But I think that's the last time we hear his name
但可惜嗰係最後一次我哋聽到神說話。
in chapter 1.
喺第一章裏面只得一次，
It's as if the mission has been completely forgotten.
似乎神嘅使命就被遺忘咗啦。
It's simply a matter of doing our thing, and if we can take the land, fine.
似乎就係個人就做自己喜歡做嘅嘢啊！我哋能夠攻佔地土就好啦。
And if not, doesn't matter.
得唔到咧，冇乜所謂啦。
So by the time you get to the Danites at the end,
所以去到呢章結束，去但支派嘅情況呢，
not only have they made alliances with Canaanites,
唔單止佢哋同迦南人結盟，
they haven't even tried to take the land that God had promised them.
佢哋甚至咧冇用心咧去奪取神俾佢哋嘅地。
This is a sorry story.
呢個係一個好可惜嘅故事。
This is why things go wrong in the book.
所以你睇到呢個就係問題嘅症結啦。
They have forgotten that God brought them out of Egypt to bring them to the land.
佢哋忘記咗神帶佢哋出埃及，係要佢哋進駐喺迦南地。
The land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
就係佢向亞伯拉罕、以撒、雅各所應許嘅地。
And the land in which they were to become a witness and a light to the whole world.
佢要喺呢個地方係成為一個見證，係成為外邦人嘅一個嘅光台。
But the mission is completely forgotten.
但佢哋忘記咗呢個嘅使命。
And look at what happens in chapter 2,
我哋睇下第二章啦，
verses 1 to 5.
第一節至到第五節，
This is the Lord's response.
呢個就係神嘅回應啦。
The angel of the Lord came from Gilgal to Bochim.
耶和華啲使者從吉甲上到波金，
And he said,
然後佢話：
I brought you up out of Egypt. I led you into the land that I swore to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you.
神話我使你們從埃及上來，領你們到我向你們列祖起誓應許之地。我又說，我永不離廢棄與你們所立的約。
And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land.
你們也不可與這地的居民立約，
You shall tear down their altars.
要拆毀他們的祭壇。
But you have not obeyed me. What have you done?
你們竟沒有聽從我，為什麼這樣
So
行
I
呢？
said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you.
因此我又說，我必不將他們從你們面前趕出，他們必作你立下的荊棘，他們的神必作你們的網羅。
This is the Lord's evaluation of what's happened.
呢個就係神對佢哋所作所為嘅評語。
In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 to 5, you have in detail a description of what the people are supposed to do.
喺申命記嘅第7章1至5節，又好清楚嘅講明咗神要求以色列人點樣對待迦南人，
Tear down their altars, smash their idols.
拆毀佢哋嘅祭壇，毀滅佢哋嘅偶像。
We're not to tolerate any remnant of Canaanite religion.
我哋唔可以容許任何嘅迦南人嘅偶像剩餘落嚟。
But of course, these people have forgotten the mission.
但百姓忘記咗佢哋嘅使命。
Worse than that,
更加可怕嘅係，
they've forgotten the Lord.
佢連神都忘記咗啦。
And this is what is described in chapter 2, verse 6 to 3, verse 6.
佢哋點樣忘記神呢？喺第2章嘅第6節開始就描述啦。
Notice chapter 2, verse 6.
第6節，
When Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went to their inheritance to possess the land.
從前約書亞打發以色列百姓去的時候，他們各歸自己的地業，佔據地土。
They served the Lord all the days of Joshua and the elders who survived him.
約書亞在世和約書亞死後，那些見耶和華為以色列人行所大事的長老還在的時候，
Those
百
who
姓
had
都侍
seen
奉
the
耶和
great
華。
work.
就當佢哋嗰啲仍然見過耶和華所行大事嘅長老仍在嘅時候，
But look at verse 10.
但留意第10節，
All that generation was gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation who didn't know the Lord, nor the work he had done for Israel.
那世代的人也都歸了自己的列祖，後來有別的世代興起，不知道耶和華，也不知道耶和華為以色列人所行的事。
How quickly we forget.
我哋係幾咁容易忘記呢？
The next generation.
只不過第二個嘅世代啫，
They've forgotten the Exodus.
竟然忘記咗出埃及嘅事，
They've forgotten the covenant at Sinai.
忘記咗西乃山嘅立約，
They've forgotten God's care in the desert.
忘記咗喺曠野神嗰個眷顧，
And they've forgotten that the land is God's gift to them.
又忘記咗呢個地係神俾佢哋嘅禮物，
It's all gone.
一切都遺忘了。
They forgot the Lord.
佢哋忘記咗耶和華。
The consequences of this loss of memory are disastrous.
呢個失憶咧係一個好可怕嘅後果。
And this is when the author then describes for us this repeated cycle of apostasy and oppression.
所以作者咧就重複講呢個嘅惡性嘅循環啦。
7 times he says the Israelites did the evil in the eyes of the Lord.
作者7次咁講，以色列人行了耶和華眼中看為惡的事。
Now, I am aware at this point that there is a problem with the Chinese language.
唔知道有咩問題啦？佢話我哋嘅中文好似有啲問題。
You don't have the article.
我哋係冇個官詞嘅，
And so we translate this as if the sons of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord.
所以個翻譯咧就係話以色列人咧行耶和華眼中看為惡嘅事。
And the English translations have that too.
英文翻譯都係咁樣寫嘅。
But in English, it's a mistake because they could fix it.
但係英文係錯嘅，其實佢哋可以改變嘅。
This is not just evil generally.
呢個並唔係就咁講話行惡，一個有好普遍性嘅形容
It's
詞，
a very specific evil.
係指某一個嘅惡事，
The evil.
就係嗰個官詞喺度指定嘅某一個嘅惡事。
What is it?
咁呢個惡事係乜嘢咧？
They abandoned the Lord and went after other gods.
就係佢哋離棄耶和華，係跟從別神。
They forgot the Lord.
佢哋忘記耶和華，
And they exchanged him for the gods of the land.
佢哋以其他嘅神去代替咗耶和華。
They exchanged the God who has no eyes but has seen them from the beginning.
佢哋係用一啲有眼但係唔能夠睇嘢嘅一啲偶像去代替神。
They exchanged them for images which have eyes but don't see.
佢哋將一啲偶像係代替咗耶和華。
The God who has no ears but he hears everything.
雖然神係冇耳朵，但係神係聽到一切嘅嘢。
They exchanged for gods that have ears but don't hear a thing.
不過以色列人就揾一啲偶像係有耳朵嘅，不過就唔能夠聽到嘢。
And the God who had spoken so clearly to them, even though he has no mouth,
雖然神好似係冇口，但佢已經係好清楚嘅將佢嘅心意向佢子民説明。
they exchanged for gods which have mouths but can't speak.
但以色列人呢，就寧願揾一啲嘅神
That's what
有口
happens.
不能言嘅。
And of course, thanks to what the archaeologists have discovered, we now know what we're talking about.
好多謝啲考古學嘅工作，令到我哋今日知道當日以色列人拜嘅偶像係乜嘢。
I have a few pictures here of the gods that come, the Canaanite gods.
我有幾幅嘅圖畫，就係啲迦南人嘅偶像啦。
This is a picture of Baal.
呢個係巴力嘅一個嘅公仔，
He's the weather god.
佢係嗰位暴風雨嘅神。
So what he holds in his left hand is a bolt of lightning,
所以佢左手裏面咧，佢揸住嘅咧，其實係一個嘅閃電嘅，
which is a symbol of the rain that he provides.
就代表咗佢能夠帶嚟雨水。
Don't you like this kind of God?
你中唔中意呢種嘅神明咧？
Of course, he's got eyes,
冇錯，佢有眼喎，
but he can't see.
不過睇唔到嘅；
He's got ears, but he can't hear.
有耳不能聽，
He's got a mouth, but he can't speak.
有口不能言。
But this is what we bow down to.
但呢個咧就以色列人所跪拜㗎啦。
Here's another image. Notice that it's a stereotypical image. He's always walking very confidently against the enemy.
大家睇下呢啲嘅形象咧，佢都係有一個好典型嘅一個嘅姿態嘅，係好似好有信心、好有能力
And he
嘅。
rides the clouds to bring the rain.
佢就駕馭喺雲嘅上面咧，帶嚟雨水。
You see, these are fertility gods.
大家要明白，呢就係我哋叫做一種生殖力嘅一種嘅宗教神明。
When people are concerned only about health, happiness and success, this is what they worship.
如果人只關注嘅就係健康啦、財富啦、快樂啦，呢啲就係佢哋會拜嘅偶像啦。
These are the gods of Canaan.
呢個就係迦南人嘅偶像。
Here's another one.
呢個係另外一個啦。
Notice again the pose. He's very confident.
大家睇同一樣，好似好有信心嘅一個嘅姿態。
He can really help you, can't he?
佢可唔可以真係幫到你咧？
Here's another one.
又係另一個啦。
This is El.
嗱，呢個係另一個嘅偶像。
We'll talk about El later.
我哋遲啲先再詳細講佢啦。
El is the grandpa.
嗱，呢個嘅伊勒或者 L 咧就係呢個偶像嘅祖父啊，一個最高嘅嗰位嘅偶像。
He is the father of all the gods.
佢就係所有嘅偶像嘅爸爸。
The only problem is in Canaanite mythology.
但係喺呢個嘅迦南人嗰個嘅神話故事裏面咧，
He's a senile old man.
佢係一個好似咧好老態龍鍾嘅一個老人嚟嘅。
He's lost his power to think straight.
佢咧冇一個嘅能夠思想清晰嘅能力。
And he can't control his family.
佢又管唔到佢啲細路仔啦。
But that's a nice God to worship.
呢個就係佢哋拜嘅偶像啦。
There's another image of him.
呢個係另外一幅嘅圖畫，就係呢個 L 伊勒。
Notice whereas Baal is regularly marching, coming to your aid.
嗱，留意啦，巴力嘅樣咧，永遠都好似咧佢喺度係去大步踏前嘅嚟到幫助你咁樣。
El sits on the throne.
咁 L 咧就坐喺度，乜都唔做嘅。
There's another image.
又係另外兩個圖畫。
Plated with gold.
有金嚟到係鋪喺上面添。
Then we really have a good God.
有金鋪嘅梗係好啦，係咪？
Another one.
另外一個啦。
Asherah.
呢個就係亞斯他錄。
Asherah in Canaanite mythology is El's wife.
喺迦南人嘅神話裏面咧，亞斯他錄咧就頭先嗰個伊勒嘅嗰個嘅配偶嚟嘅。
And she's the mother of all the gods.
佢就係所有偶像嘅媽媽啦。
This is Baal's mother.
呢個係巴力嘅媽媽。
And Ishtar's mother.
亦都係另一個叫伊斯他嘅媽媽。
Of course, this is the Asherah represents the female principle in the fertility religion.
亞斯他錄咧可以話代表咗呢種嘅繁殖宗教裏面嗰個女性嘅形象。
Here's one of Asherah's daughters.
呢個係頭先嗰位嘅女神嘅女嚟嘅，其實係。
Astarte. Another one.
呢個係另外一個。
Here's Grandma Asherah.
呢個就係嗰個嘅祖母亞舍拉。
Another image.
都係亞舍拉嘅形象。
Wonderful gods these are.
你又覺得係咪好奇妙呢？呢啲神像
They can really help you.
佢哋真係幫到你嘅咩？
Really?
係咪真呢？
This is an interesting one here. You can't see it very plainly, but let me give you another picture of it. There you have it.
呢個係一個好有趣嘅一個嘅考古學文物嚟㗎。但呢幅係一幅比較清楚嘅圖畫。
And what's shocking about this is not only the image,
呢個令人吃驚嘅咧，就係唔單止係嗰幅嘅圖畫，
but the text.
係裡面所寫嘅字，
It's a blessing.
係一個祝福嘅説話嚟嘅。
I have blessed you by Yahweh of Shomron.
呢個講嘅就係話咧，係我以耶和華嘅名嚟到祝福你。
Which is Samaria.
呢個所講緊咧，就係喺撒瑪利亞呢個地
And
方
by
嘅，
his Asherah.
同埋咧係以佢嘅亞舍拉嘅名嚟到祝福你。
Yahweh has an Asherah?
咁係咪意思即係話耶和華都有個亞舍拉咧？
That's his wife.
因為呢個圖畫裏面咧，佢就真係有個妻子喎。
And of course, you can see what happens when when your religions get all mixed up.
呢個就係當你嘅信仰真理係唔清晰嘅時候所產生嘅後果啦。
Yes, it is good to bless people by Yahweh.
冇錯，奉神嘅名祝福人係好好嘅。
But why didn't we leave it there and stop?
點解淨係用神嘅名咧？
This is what happens in the book of Judges.
我哋發覺士師記就係咁樣啦。
On the outside, you have Yahweh worship.
冇錯，表面上好似敬拜耶和華，
But on the inside, it's really all pagan.
但係裡面嗰個嘅心思念嗰種嘅精神咧，全部係迦南人嗰種嘅偶像思想。
Here you have an image of Asherah
大家亦都再一次睇到個亞舍拉嘅一個圖畫，
in the form of the tree.
係一幅好似樹咁嘅象徵嚟嘅，
It's the symbol of fertility and life.
係代表咗生殖嘅力量同埋生命。
Here's a whole bunch of Asherahs.
有好多位嘅亞舍拉啦。
Well, it's a problem.
呢個係一個問題嚟嘅。
This is what they have abandoned the Lord for.
佢哋離棄耶和華就要得着呢啲嘅偶像，
To worship these gods.
就係拜呢啲嘅偶像啦。
That's what happens when we forget where we came from.
呢個就係當我哋忘記我哋從何而嚟嘅後果。
And what the consequence of it is expressed again in this cycle of rebellion and oppression and crying out and the Lord hearing their prayers.
所以我哋睇到就呢個循環嘅出現嚇，佢哋嘅背道帶嚟外敵嘅欺壓，跟住佢哋向神呼求，然後神又賜呢個嘅拯救者。
But the writer doesn't stop simply by describing the Israelites' spiritual harlotry.
但係作者唔單止淨係喺度描述緊以色列人嗰個屬靈嗰個嘅問題，
He is particularly interested to describe the Lord's response.
佢特別重點咧係要講神嗰個嘅回應。
First, he says that God was angry with the people.
首先佢講係乜嘢咧？就係神對以色列民發怒。
Chapter 2, verse 12 and 14 and 20.
喺第2章嘅12、14、20節。
And because he was angry with the people, he stopped fighting for them.
就因為神發怒，所以神唔再為佢哋爭戰。
Chapter 2, verse 14.
第2章嘅第14節。
In fact, he began to treat the Israelites as if they were Canaanites.
神嘅怒氣發作，所以咧佢將佢哋當做好似迦南人咁嚟對待。
Chapter 2, verse 15, he was their enemy.
第15節話神就作咗佢哋嘅仇敵。
Of course, that's a shocking notion.
當然呢個係一個好驚人嘅一個嘅説話。
Wasn't he their covenant God?
神唔係佢哋立咗約咩？
Hadn't he called them to himself and stamped on them his name?
唔係神揀選咗佢哋，稱佢為佢名下嘅子民咩？
But now they're his enemy.
但而家神成為咗佢哋嘅仇敵。
And of course, this image of an angry God is offensive to modern readers.
當然今日現代嘅讀者咧，對神係一個嘅憤怒嘅神咧，會係好反感。
Even many Christians.
就算好多嘅基督徒，
We think that God is a God of boundless and unconditional love.
我哋認為咧神係一個毫無條件嘅，而且無止境嘅會愛我哋嘅。
And we forget that grace is a privilege.
我哋忘記咗恩典其實係一個嘅特權嚟嘅。
The Israelites were a privileged people.
以色列人係一個好蒙一個嘅特權嘅一個民族。
And to treat grace with such contempt.
如果我哋將恩典睇作係平常鄙視嘅話，
And then to disregard his claims on us.
而忘記咗神對我哋嘅要求，
Renders us his enemies.
就會令我哋成為神嘅敵人啦。
We have trampled underfoot the grace of God.
我哋藐視神嘅恩典。
These are not Canaanites.
嗱，呢啲唔係迦南人嚟嘅喎。
Oh, yes, they act like Canaanites.
冇錯，佢哋行為好似迦南人，
But they're supposed to be the Lord's people.
但佢哋應該就係神嘅子民嚟嘅，
Then act like it.
應該就係生活應該似神嘅子
But
民。
of course, the book is also about the Lord's grace.
但呢卷書卷更加係關於神嘅恩典。
He's not only angry,
神唔單止發怒，
but when the people cry for help, what does he do?
當百姓呼求嘅時候，神會點回應呢？
He sends a deliverer.
佢就為佢哋興起拯救者。
Well, I think I might have done that once or twice.
嗱，如果係我呢，或者我會做一兩次嘅。
But if I had been God 6, 7 times,
但如果我係神，我會唔會做6次、7次咁多呢？
I don't think so.
我就唔會啦。
But God is gracious.
但係神係有恩典嘅，
Time after time after time,
一次
He gives in.
一次一次，神拯救佢哋。
he raises up judges.
佢興起士師，
He is with the judge.
佢與士師同在，
He saves the people.
佢拯救百姓。
If anything positive happens in the book, it's because he did it graciously.
如果書卷裏面有任何正面嘅事情呢，完全係神嘅恩典嘅作為。
What then is the solution?
咁樣解決嘅方案係乜嘢呢？
Well, having given us an introduction to the book,
嗱，我哋睇咗書卷嘅引言。
in chapter 3, we start to see how God actually solves the problem.
喺第3章開始，我哋睇到神會點解決問題啦。
And that is by giving the people judges.
就係為百姓預備士師。
In response to the oppression,
就當欺壓來臨嘅時候咧，
which was the response to their sin.
欺壓係因為佢哋嘅罪惡。
So what we want to do in the remainder of our time
喺餘下嘅時間咧，
is look at the first two cycles very quickly.
我哋好快嘅睇睇第一、第二個循環。
And we have to run through this quickly.
我哋要睇得好快啦。
I've mentioned before the scheme that we have.
之前我提過嗰個嘅方程式係點樣？
The sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord.
以色列人行耶和華眼中看為惡的事。
The Lord sells them into the hands of the enemy.
於是神就將佢哋交付敵人啦。
On this map, you see from where the enemies come.
呢個地圖俾大家睇到敵人係從
It
何而
starts
來。
with Cushan Rishathaim at the top.
喺呢個地圖嘅上方咧，就係呢個嘅米所波大米嘅王嘅攻擊。
And then we have the Moabites and the Philistines and the Midianites and the Ammonites.
然後就有呢個嘅摩押人、非利士人同埋呢個米甸人，
All brought in by God
全部都係神帶嚟嘅敵人，
to call the people back to himself,
為咗要挽回佢嘅子
to
民，
remind them of their sin,
係提醒佢哋嘅罪惡，
and to get them back on track.
係想佢哋翻返去正軌。
Then we have a notice of how long the Israelites served the enemy.
咁我跟住我哋睇到就係話以色列人服侍敵人幾
The
耐，
Israelites crying out to the Lord.
以色列人呼求神，
The announcement of the Lord raising a deliverer.
於是神興起一個拯救者
A，description of how the deliverance is provided.
咁就會經文描述神點樣拯救，
And then a concluding note on the land having rest.
然後結束就係話佢哋享受太平幾耐。
I have a chart here that shows how that pattern is followed.
呢個嘅圖表俾大家睇到咧，頭先所提到幾個嘅主題咧係點樣嘅嚟到係實現喺故事嘅裏面。
You will notice the first two, Othniel and Ehud, have all of those steps.
大家留意咧，特別喺你哋嘅左邊啦嚇，第一、第二個行嗰度咧就係有俄陀聶同埋呢個以弗，每一點頭先所提到嘅重點咧都出現喺佢哋嘅故事循環裏面嘅。
And then there's Shamgar, has none of them.
然後珊迦咧就冇一個嘅
We'll
頭先所提到嘅出現。
We'll talk about that one yet.
我哋遲啲會再講講佢，
Only one verse.
就一節經文。
And then you have Barak and Gideon and Jephthah and Samson.
然後有巴拉、基甸、耶弗他同埋參孫。
It's interesting that the phrase, the Lord raised up a deliverer, is missing.
大家留意一句説話，神興起拯救者咧，喺呢幾位士師嘅生平裏面係冇出現過嘅。
Instead, you have a whole story of how the Lord raised up the deliverer.
然後反為咧經文係俾我哋呢個故事講神係點樣
So
興
he's
起呢個嘅士
actually
師，
giving us a fuller picture.
所以其實係俾你一個更加清晰嘅圖畫，神點樣興起士師。
Let's begin then with Aram, Naharaim, and the Othniel cycle.
我哋第一個循環咧就係俄陀聶咁講到咧，佢同呢個亞蘭人大家個翻譯嗰度係那哈念咧，喺聲聞聖經係叫米所波大米。
This story is told in only 6 verses.
呢個故事只有6節嘅經文。
Chapter 3, verse 9 to 14.
第3章第7至第11節，
Actually, I should have said only 4 verses.
或者只有4節嘅經文。
The 9, 10, 11. I still can't count. It's 3 actually.
我都唔係好識計數㗎啦，其實有3節經文啫。
3 verses devoted to this.
只有3節經文講呢位嘅士師。
Which is really remarkable because this is the most powerful of all the oppressors.
其實係好奇怪嘅，因為喺咁多個敵人裏面咧，俄陀聶所面對嘅係最強大嘅敵人。
There's a problem with this map.
呢個地圖有啲嘅問題嘅係。
It looks like the arrow has sent him off into the sea.
嗰個紅色嘅箭嘴咧，好似將個敵人帶咗落去地中海嗰度。
When we adjusted the size and shape of the map, the arrow didn't move with us, and we forgot to move that.
就因為咧，當我哋去整呢個嘅 PowerPoint 嘅時候，個地圖就改變咗一啲嘅嘢，但係嗰個箭嘴就冇喐到。
But it starts out in the right place.
嗰個起點咧就啱嘅。
He comes from up here on the other side of the Euphrates River.
呢個敵人係來自由法拉底河嘅另外一邊，
And he comes all the way down to the promised land,
一直南下去到呢個應許之地。
which tells us that he is really an important ruler.
所以話俾我哋聽咧，佢係一個好重要嘅一個嘅領袖，一個君王嚟嘅。
He's not just a neighbor.
佢並唔係一個喺以色列附近嘅小民族。
He's come a long way and conquered a lot of territory in between.
佢嚟自遠方，所以路上面係征服咗好多嘅民眾嘅。
But we don't know much else about him.
但我哋對佢認識唔多。
He has a strange name.
佢個名就好奇怪嘅。
But how did he oppress them?
佢點樣去壓迫以色列人呢？
How did God raise up Othniel?
神點樣興起俄陀聶呢？
How did God give the victory?
神點樣賜下勝利呢？
He doesn't tell us.
經文冇講，
It's just a summary statement.
只係一個好簡單嘅總結。
But of course, we've read a little bit about Othniel in chapter 1.
當然啦，其實喺第一章咧，我哋已經對俄陀聶有
There
少少
we were
認識。
introduced to him.
喺嗰度有個少少嘅介紹嘅。
This is Caleb's nephew,
原來咧佢係迦勒嘅一個嘅侄兒，
which is very interesting
非常之嘅有趣。
because Caleb isn't even a native Israelite.
因為迦勒本身咧唔係一個以色列人。
Have you ever noticed how he's always introduced?
大家有冇留意經文點樣介紹迦勒㗎？
Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite,
好多時都話佢係呢個嘅基尼人，
which is an Edomite tribe.
其實係一個嘅米甸裏面嘅一個嘅部落。
But here is a man who is such a man of faith
但我哋睇到呢個嘅俄陀聶係一個好有信心嘅人。
that when the Lord needed scouts to go out and scout the promised land,
唔係呢個係關於迦勒。當神差派探子去窺探迦南地嘅時候，
this convert represented Judah.
呢個係代表猶大支派嘅。
That's what he is, a convert.
冇錯，迦勒咧係一個歸信猶太人
We know he's a
耶和華嘅一個嘅外邦人。
We know he's a convert not only because he's called the Kenizzite,
我哋知道佢係一個外邦人，唔單止因為佢被稱為基尼人。
but look at his name.
留意下佢嘅名字，
What does Caleb mean?
迦勒代表咩意思咧？
Puppy dog.
就係狗仔。
No Israelite would call a son a dog.
以色列人從來都唔會叫佢仔個名叫做狗仔嘅，
To the Israelites, dogs are unclean.
因為以色列人咧睇狗咧就係不潔，
Only a foreigner would do this
只有外邦人咧先會咁樣起個名，
in a context where dogs have a different connotation.
因為外邦人對狗有個唔同嘅睇法。
But notice, when God needs a deliverer, he calls the convert.
但你發覺神興起拯救者咧，竟然興起個外邦人，
And he sends him out and he beats the big boy from Aram Naharaim.
當俄陀聶出去打仗嘅時候咧，就能夠擊敗呢個從遠方而嚟嘅君王。
This turns out to be the best story of all,
而呢個咧喺士師記裏面係最好嘅故事，
even though we don't know the details.
雖然我哋唔知道細節。
Let's go then to Ehud.
然後我哋睇以弗啦，
Ehud and the fatted calf.
以弗同嗰隻肥牛
Eglon.
伊基倫，
Don't you love Eglon?
你中唔中意伊基倫呢？
His name means calf.
佢嘅名咧就係牛嘅意思。
3 times in the text, it talks about how fat he is.
經文3次提到伊基倫係好肥胖嘅。
And of course, it climaxes in this cartoon image
個高潮就喺呢個好滑稽嘅一個嘅圖畫裏面，
of Ehud stabbing him and his fat covering the sword.
就係當以弗咧一劍插落去嗰陣時候咧，佢劍係俾啲肥肉夾住嘅。
I think as the author is writing this story, he can hardly contain himself.
我諗作者一路寫一路自己都忍唔住笑。
He wants you to laugh
其實咧佢係想你笑嘅，
because everything about this story is ridiculous.
因為成個故事都係好可笑、好滑稽嘅。
We have a fatted calf who is oppressing the Israelites.
有隻肥牛咧就喺度壓迫緊以色列人。
Here's where he is sitting on his throne at Jericho.
伊基倫咧當時咧就係駐守喺呢個嘅耶利哥城嗰度。
And the Israelites are bringing their tribute.
咁以色列人咧就要送禮物俾佢。
But whom does God raise up to deliver the Israelites from the fatted calf?
咁神興起個乜嘢嘅拯救者嚟到幫助以色列人脫離呢隻肥牛嘅轄制咧？
It's Ehud.
就係以弗啦。
What's wrong with Ehud?
以弗有咩問題咧？
He's left-handed.
佢係左手便利。
That's a handicap.
呢個其實可以話係一種障礙嚟㗎。
Some of you are left-handed.
唔知大家中有冇人係用左手嘅咧？
I have a brother for any illustration.
咁我咧係有一個嘅弟兄咧，可以講好多嘅故仔嘅係。
I have 2 brothers who are left-handed.
我有2個嘅弟弟咧，
And
係
they are
可以
handicapped.
亦都係左手嘅係。
But in this context, left-handedness is a special handicap.
但喺呢個故事嘅內容裏面咧，左手便利係一個特別嘅一個嘅原因嘅。
Here's a picture of what a normal army would look like as they march out into battle.
呢度有一個圖畫，就係當正常嘅軍隊出戰嘅時候嘅情況。
In the top row, you notice everyone all these men are holding their shields in their left hands.
大家留意啦，上排咧就係正常軍隊，佢哋嗰個嘅左手就係揸住個盾牌嘅。
And they've got their weapons in their right.
然後咧右手就揸住佢哋嘅武器啦。
And if you've got everybody like that, it works because you're protected all the way through.
如果大家都係左手揸住盾牌咧，就好好嘅，因為你彼此去保護咗啦。
But what are you going to do with somebody who's left-handed?
但係點知咧，有個人咧係左手嘅喎，係
He doesn't help.
佢一啲都幫唔到忙。
And I think that's actually why the Israelites had him bringing the tribute.
所以我諗呢個係個原因，點解以色列人會揾以弗走去送呢個嘅禮物？
He's not good for anything else.
因為佢乜嘢都唔識做噶啦。
You don't respect a left-handed person.
當時嚟講咧，就係唔會尊重一個左手嘅人。
Unless, of course, you've got a whole troop of left-handed people.
當然啦，如果你成隊軍隊咧都係用左手就唔同啦。
And we'll run into troops like that in the book of Judges.
其實士師記咧就係有隊咁嘅軍隊啦，係左手嘅。
When we get to the last chapters,
喺最後一章我哋會見到啦。
the Benjamites are fearsome warriors because they have a whole troop of left-handed people.
便雅憫支派嘅軍隊係好勇猛嘅，因為全隊都係左手嘅係。
And it's totally ironical.
其實就好諷刺嘅係。
Because the name Benjamin means son of the right hand.
便雅憫個名係咩意思咧？就係我右手之子。
But if you've got a whole troop of left-handers, it works.
不過咧，如果全隊軍隊都係左手嘅，都冇問題嘅。
But nothing is natural in this picture.
所以呢個故事裏面冇樣嘢係好自然
But
嘅。
look at Ehud's tactics.
但我哋睇下以弗佢嗰個嘅戰略。
Ehud comes to Eglon and he says, I've got a secret for you.
佢走去呢個嘅伊基倫嘅面前話：王啊，我有件機密事話俾你聽。
Actually, a secret word.
其實可以咁講係一個機密嘅信息。
Well, and I'm sure Eglon must think there's a conspiracy out there.
可能咧，伊基倫嗰時諗係咪有一個陰謀發生緊呢？
He's going to expose the conspirators.
以弗咧會話俾佢哋聽嗰啲陰謀。
And so he tells his bodyguards, excuse me, you're dismissed for a while.
於是佢對佢嗰啲嘅隨從就話：你哋行開一陣間啦。
Here's a guy who is fat not only in his body,
呢個嘅王咧，唔單止佢身體肥胖，
but he's also fat in his head.
但係佢嘅思想咧都係好論盡嘅。
Who in his right mind would do that?
邊個有正常思想嘅人會咁樣做咧？
This guy who can hardly move
呢個好肥胖嘅皇帝，佢幾乎行都行唔喐。
is going to be alone in the room with this guy?
佢竟然單獨個人嚟到會見以弗。
And of course, he doesn't suspect anything of Ehud.
當然啦，佢對以弗係一啲懷疑都冇。
You see, if you're a left-handed person,
你知道噃，如果你係左手嘅人咧，
you have your dagger in the right side.
咁你嘅劍就會擺喺右邊啦。
And if you're suspicious of anybody, you always look and see if there's a bulge in the garments on the left.
如果啲士衛懷疑你有咩嘅武器咧，佢就會去睇你嘅左邊嘅，其實係。
And if you don't see it there, you're all right.
如果佢摸你你嘅左邊冇嘢咧，咁就覺得你冇問題啦。
And then Ehud leans over to Eglon.
於是咧，以弗就係近前去到伊基倫嘅
And
面
he
前，
changes one word.
然後佢轉咗佢嘅説話一個嘅字。
Before he said, I have a secret word for you.
之前佢話我有機密事話俾你聽，
Now he says, I have a divine word for you.
而家佢就話咧，我有一個從神而嚟嘅事話俾你聽，唔使我講啦。
And of course, you need to remember that the Hebrew word for word
大家要明白喺原文希伯來文裏面嗰個事嗰個嘅字咧
davar.
，davar
It can mean word, and it usually does.
通常咧就係話説話或者字咁嘅意思嘅。
But it can also mean a sentence.
但亦都可以指個句子，
It can mean a story.
可以講個故事，
It can mean an event.
可以指件事件，
But it can also mean an object.
亦都可以指一個嘅物件。
And what's the secret object he's got?
所以以弗有個乜嘢嘅秘密嘅物件呢？
And he stabs him in the gut.
然後咧，佢一下就刺入去，
And the guy falls to the floor.
於是咧，伊基倫跌喺地上面，
And all his innards come out.
佢所有裡面嘅排泄物都走晒出嚟啦。
And Ehud escapes.
於是咧，以弗就逃走咗啦。
And the guardsmen, the bodyguards are outside wondering, what's taking so long with Eglon?
咁啲侍衛喺門外面就好奇怪啦，點解搞咗咁耐咧？
And they knock on the door.
於是佢哋就敲下個門，
And they smell something.
佢哋都聞到一啲嘅嘢啦。
And they think he's going to the toilet.
佢哋以為佢去廁所咯噃。
And they open the door and there he is, dead.
後來打開個門，見到個皇帝就死咗喺嗰度啦。
In the meantime, Ehud's way out there,
喺呢個時候裏面咧，以弗就已經走咗啦。
rallying the troops.
於是你招聚百姓，
And the Lord gives the victory.
神就俾佢哋一個好大嘅勝利。
I don't know what to think about Ehud.
我真係唔知點樣去睇以弗呢個人物，
I don't know if I should like him.
我都唔知我應唔應該中意佢。
I guess it depends on which side you are.
嗱，睇下你哋支持邊一方啦。
But this sounds like a typical Canaanite story.
但呢個好似一個典型嘅迦南人嘅故事，
That's how Canaanites got rid of kings they didn't like.
因為迦南人咧就係咁樣嚟到除滅佢
They
哋嘅皇帝，
assassinated them.
佢會暗殺佢嘅。
But the interesting thing is the Lord raises up Ehud.
但好奇怪嘅就係神興起
And
以
the
弗，
Lord gives the victory.
係神俾佢勝利。
It's a cartoon,
呢個好似個卡通漫畫一
a
樣嘅故
very
事，
interesting cartoon.
係一個好有趣嘅卡通漫畫故
Let's
事。
go to Shamgar.
我哋睇山家啦，
We have 2 minutes for Shamgar.
我哋有2分鐘去講山家。
But that's all the author had for Shamgar too.
不過作者都係講得咁短嘅啫喎。
Why does he give us only 1 sentence on Shamgar?
點解佢淨係講咗一句嘅説話關於山家呢位善師咧？
You see a clue already in the guy's name.
如果你留意佢個名咧，你就明啦。
I said before that Hebrew writes only with consonants and no vowels.
頭先我提過希伯來文寫嘅時候咧，只有嗰個子音冇個母音
And
嘅。
if you look at a name like Shamgar, how many consonants have we got?
如果你留意山家呢個名咧，佢有幾多個子音咧
G-R.
？4個嘅係。
Does it work in Chinese? Not really. 4 consonants.
其實係有4個嘅字母喺度嘅。
That's guaranteed proof that he's not an Israelite.
嗱，呢個就好充足嘅證明咧，佢唔係以色列人啦，
It's a mark of an outsider.
係一個外邦人嘅記號。
I think he's a Hittite
我覺得佢係一個嘅黑人，
or a Hurrian.
或者一個嘅荷利人。
But there are a couple of other things about Shamgar that we should notice.
不過你留意關於山家有幾件嘅事。
Shamgar's the son of Anat.
山家係亞拿嘅兒子。
Who's Anat?
亞拿係邊個咧？
It's another one of the goddesses in the Canaanite religion.
其實咧係迦南人裏面另外一個嘅女偶像。
He's not only not Israelite,
原來山家唔單止唔係以色列人，
he's a devotee of Anat.
仲係一個拜亞拿嘅一個嘅人。
But God uses him to give Israel the victory.
但神竟然用佢嚟到俾以色列人有勝利喎。
He struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad and he saved Israel.
經文話佢用趕牛嘅棍子打死咗600個非利士人，拯救咗以色列人。
Why does the author have only 1 verse for him?
點解作者只係用一句經文提到山家呢？
I think he's embarrassed.
我諗咧佢覺得唔好意思啊，係。
Leadership is in such short supply among God's people
原來神嘅子民裏面係揾唔到好嘅領袖，
that we have to go outside to do God's business.
我哋要去揾外人嚟到完成神嘅工作，
What a shame.
係咪好羞恥呢？
What a disaster.
係好可怕嘅
That's
事。
what's wrong with Israel.
呢個就係以色列人嘅問題啦。
But of course, this dilemma wasn't only Israel's dilemma.
不過呢個唔單止係以色列人嘅問題，
how often doesn't it happen to us?
我哋又點呢？
That in the church,
喺教會嘅裏面，
we have become so godless
喺教會裏面，我哋好似冇咗神啊咁
that
樣。
the world has to come in and solve our problems.
結果世俗嘅方法就進入教會嚟到解決問題啦，
It's an embarrassment.
係好羞恥嘅。
But the Lord says, I will build my church,
但神話我要建立我嘅教會，
and the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
陰間嘅權勢唔能夠勝過佢。
The Israelites may forget the agenda,
或者以色列人忘記咗神俾佢哋嘅使命，
but God won't.
但神咧唔會忘記佢嘅
And
計劃。
even if he has to use a pagan to do the work,
就算神要用一個外邦人嚟完成佢嘅工作，
he will do his work.
神仍然會完成佢嘅工作。
My brothers and sisters,
我弟兄姊妹，
a church that permits itself to be squeezed into the mold of the world
如果你容許呢個嘅世界世俗佢哋到進入咗我哋嘅當中，
shouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves hostage to our enemies.
我哋就會發覺，我哋就會成為咗仇敵嘅呢個嘅被擄去嘅。
The Lord is under no obligation to those who claim his name but don't live a life of thankful and grateful obedience.
如果我哋只係有神嘅名字掛住喺口邊，但我哋嘅生活行為唔能夠按照神嘅心意而活咧，神係可以一啲都唔理會我哋嘅。
But at the same time, we can take great hope.
但同一時間，我哋有一個盼望。
God is sensitive to the groaning of his people.
神對佢子民嘅呼喊係聽到嘅，
And he waits to demonstrate his power and his grace
佢好急不及待係要彰顯佢自己嘅能力同埋恩典，
in freeing them from the tyranny of evil
就要將佢哋從呢個嘅罪惡嘅勢力裏面釋放出嚟，
and the tyranny of their own foolishness.
同埋喺佢哋自己嗰個愚拙嗰個嘅情況裏面釋放出嚟。
The means by which God does this often catches us by surprise.
好多時候神拯救嘅方法係令我哋驚訝。
In the absence of solid leadership from within,
當以色列人當中冇好嘅領袖出現嘅時候，
he may call up one who is not of the tradition,
佢可能會呼召一啲唔係傳統人會接納嘅嗰啲嘅英雄領袖，
the proselyte,
或者一啲嘅外邦人歸信以色列人嘅神，或者一個新信嘅肢體，
and he gives up on those who are third and fourth generation Christians.
佢將嗰啲已經好似有幾代家庭係神嘅子民嗰啲家庭放棄咗，
But it's the young Christian who is still excited about the faith that the Lord uses.
佢會用一個初信但仍然好熱烈嘅係願意被神係使用嘅信徒，
Or he may use a person whom we dismiss as handicapped.
或者神會用一個喺我哋眼中覺得係冇能力嘅人，
We would never vote that person in as our leader.
我哋可能從來都唔會投票選舉呢個人做我哋嘅領袖。
Ehud,
以弗，
he's left-handed.
佢左手啫噃，
Doesn't matter to God.
對神嚟講係冇問題。
Or God may even use an outsider.
神甚至可能用一個嘅外來者。
We have a very resourceful God
神係無所不能嘅，
who often must carry on with his work in spite of his people.
無論佢嘅子民係咩嘅光景，但神一定會完成佢嘅計劃。
He will build his church.
佢會建立佢嘅教會，
And the gates of hell will not win.
而陰間嘅權勢係唔能夠得勝。
God's work will get done.
神嘅工作必定會完成。
Thanks be to God.
讓我哋感謝神。
Amen.
阿門。